So as I've gotten older, I've grown more and more to appreciate poetry. In particular, I think in part, as I've grown older, I've grown to appreciate poets and what they have to say to us about life. And maybe in part it's because how poetry was taught when I was in high school. And you had to divide it up and analyze it, and I have over the years grown to appreciate the different ways in which poets see the world. And one of my all-time favorite poets that I discovered was Mary Oliver. Who's here has heard of Mary Oliver? A few of us. Part of the reason I discovered Mary Oliver is because she actually wrote a whole book of poetry about dogs. And anybody who could write a whole book of poetry about dogs and it not be silly is an amazing poet. And actually, Mary Oliver's I have as part of my reflection time, part of my spiritual time, part of my prayer time, is I always read a poem by Mary Oliver. She's particularly someone who can comment on and someone who speaks to nature and the human interaction. But just this week, one of the poems I read really spoke to me, and I'm gonna open by sharing that poem. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise, and we are not often very kind. And much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back. That sometimes something happens better than all the riches or all the power in the world. It could be anything. But very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Now, I love that line, yet these days it seems to me that there doesn't seem to be a lot of crumbs of joy around us, right? By that I mean I would describe the world in which we live in these days, in which we live, the busyness of our lives, which we can be often filled with running to and fro, usually doesn't mean we pay attention to those things that we might call crumbs of joy, that we might find in the small moments of our life. Yet, I'm reminded joy is not made to be a crumb. So I often find myself reading about and engaging with those I would describe as preaching what I would call a kind of disvangelical theology. I often find myself engaging with them and wrestling with their interpretations of the Bible and find their beliefs, their interpretations somewhat problematic. And I think in part, the reason I feel that way is there is a lack of joy in such a vision that they share. There isn't, let's admit, much joy in an angry God seeking to destroy the world. There isn't much joy in an idea of discipleship characterized by shame, guilt. There isn't much joy in the vision of human families where we're divided by race or where men rule over women. There isn't much joy there. And I believe, like Mary Oliver, joy is not made to be a crumb. And what I believe, and I think what's most important, that's the good news of what we preach, of a Jesus Christ, that good news should always incite joy. The verses from that, those small verses from those first 7 verses of 1 John, the author writes to those in the church, "We proclaim to you what we have seen and what we have heard, so that you may have fellowship with us." A fellowship not only between us by what we have seen and heard, but also a fellowship that exists between God, our Creator, and Christ, God the Father and Son. That's part of our fellowship. And the author proclaims that if we live in that relationship, this makes our joy complete. This fellowship, this community shared between us, this good news of God's love that sets us free makes our joy complete. The gospel does not make a crumb of joy, it makes it complete. The Greek word here is full, overabundant, wholly abounding joy. It isn't just a nice feeling or a friendly feeling, it is a sense of knowing God's love that brings fullness of joy, but knowing God's love by being connected to each other. There's another poet named Ross Gray who wrote a book about joy, a series of essays. And I love the title of this book, Insight to Joy. As in, not as INSIGHT, but insight, as in incite a riot. Insight joy. And he would share that book, and he remembers being asked by a professor once, and talking to the class about writing this book, how can you write about joy in the world that lives this day, right? There's genocide and wars. How can you write about joy when we live in a world in which people go hungry and there's disease and suffering? And Ross Gay says, well, joy is often imagined, he says, and wrongly so, often imagined as a result of some accomplishment, or joy is some acquisition we agree to. Joy, he says, is not happiness. It's different. He says, joy is not some feeling resulting from our organizing our closets and bookshelves. Do y'all remember that show? Joy is not getting a new Tesla or winning the big game or acing the test or getting a promotion, or joy is not getting the dishes sparkling clean. Joy is something more than this. Ross Gay describes joy as wild and unpredictable and transgressive and unboundaried, but joy is always solidarity, fellowship with other people. That joy, much more than happiness, though we can be happy together, is rooted in our connection, our shared humanity, not simply our personal internal worlds. That joy always is shared. And Gay, in a series of, I think, about 14 essays, talks about what incites joy for him. gardening, but not just alone, but gardening with others and sharing a passion of garden and sharing plants and seeds. Joy is found in a pickup basketball game, that shared feeling of connection and those kinds of scenes. He actually found joy in losing his phone and having to connect with other people. He even talks really profoundly in an essay about how he found joy even in the sorrow of the death of his father. And he found joy even in that sorrow because there were other human beings who shared it with him. What incites us to joy? It's a question I hope you wrestle with this week. It's a very important question to ask of ourselves. Now, for me, it might simply be taking my dogs to the dog park and sharing that experience with the other dogs and the other human beings. I don't know what their names are, but I know the dogs' names. Sense of connecting to each other, that brings joy to creation. What incites joy for you? It might simply be sharing a meal, right? With someone in conversation. It's that feeling of connection to other people's. I felt joy this week watching our kids at VBS. What a mess. There was real joy there because they shared it together. And so it occurs to me that not only is the question about what incites you to joy, where do you feel called and pulled to share in being connected to each other, to your families, to friends. It is those moments in which we truly get a sense how joy brings us that powerful sense of solidarity with each other. But we might also ask what doesn't incite us to joy. When we focus on what we hate and what disconnects us rather than what we truly love. We spend a lot of time focusing on what we share in common about what we hate rather than share in common what we truly love together. I think we do not incite joy when we deny another person's humanity, their own autonomy, when we tear down rather than when we build up. Now, I had a moment of joy a few weeks ago, and I think I can share this experience. It's been enough time. But it actually happened in worship. That's a radical idea, to feel joy in worship, right? But what often happens is I'm running from Sunday school to where we're talking about class and then trying to run in here and get ready and get some things done. But usually something happens which often sometimes makes me late, and this Sunday in particular, because as I'm coming in, Carol Farrell is waving me down, and she's holding a piece of paper. And she says, there's a new gentleman here who says he would like to give a testimony in worship. And she handed me the piece of paper, and I didn't really look at it because immediately what jumped out at me was the words Antichrist. And I remember thinking, this isn't going to sail here at Heartland at all. This isn't going to be something our folks, though I do know y'all would be loving and caring, even of someone who maybe was espousing some things you didn't believe. So I told Carol, well, I'll go talk to him. And I did kind of come in here and visit with him. And there was something, obviously, he was using a walker. He was a fairly young man. He was rather hot and sweaty. It was obvious he'd walked here. And a member of the church, I won't embarrass her, but she was being incredibly gracious, trying to get him saddled. And we discover in just a minute or two, because a woman comes in and says, you shouldn't have left the home. So we learned that, and we were unclear about whether he came from a group home or someone else's home, but he had walked here in the heat. It was really hot that morning a few weeks ago. And it was very important to him to come and worship with us. And I told him, I says, while we appreciate people's testimony, we usually don't do that in worship, but we'd love to have you here worshiping with us. And then this member of the church volunteered to drive him home so he wouldn't have to walk home. And the woman who'd come to kind of make sure he was all right said, okay, we'll come back. But so it was I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago, I came in late. The music had already ended, and y'all were going, where the heck's Alex? So there was this experience I had in which somewhat uncomfortable, and obviously he had a head injury, we learned, and he joined us for worship. And I was a little bit worried, I'll be honest, that when we do joys and concerns, he'd actually stand up and maybe give the testimony. And again, I know y'all would be loving, even if you were kind of shaking your head at this. But he didn't. But what he did do was, and those of you who were here and know who I'm talking about, what he did do was while the offertory was going and the band was playing, he stood up and he began to dance to the music. And I felt joy. I wish I'd joined him. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.